The sun was setting over the distant planet of Therax, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. It was a place of chaos, where crime ran wild, and law was nothing more than a word. Ethan, a young soldier in the galactic peacekeeping forces, had seen worse. He had been on countless missions, each one more dangerous than the last, but this one was different. This wasn't just about military strategy or intergalactic politics. It was about right and wrong. Ethan had been given an order: find the illegal slave market on Therax and shut it down. But when he saw the truth for himself, he couldn't walk away. The market was hidden deep in the city's underbelly, behind tall walls, guarded by alien thugs. It wasn't just the fact that people were being sold. It was the faces of the people, terrified, beaten down, and broken. Among the crowd, one face stood out. Lyra, a young alien girl with skin that shimmered like the moonlight, and eyes that held a lifetime of pain. She was chained to others, but there was something in her eyes. A fire that hadn't been extinguished, a spark of hope. It caught Ethan's attention immediately. She was different from the rest. She didn't beg for freedom. She looked like she would fight for it, given the chance. Ethan's heart pounded as he crouched behind a stack of crates, observing. He wasn't supposed to interfere, but how could he not? The rules of his mission said to act with caution, but the sight of these people, these innocents, was unbearable. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then moved quickly to the small control panel that operated the slave market's gates. With a few quick taps on his wristband, he hacked into the system and unlocked the gates. The market buzzed with activity, unaware of the danger that loomed. Ethan grabbed the blaster at his side and aimed it at a guard's back. The shot was quick and precise, taking him down without a sound. As the others scrambled to react, Ethan ran to Lyra's side. She stared at him with wide eyes, confused but also hopeful. "Come with me if you want to be free," he said, his voice calm but firm. Without hesitation, Lyra nodded. She didn't say a word, but the way she moved, swift and purposeful, told Ethan everything he needed to know. She was ready. Together, they moved through the chaos. Ethan fired a few more shots to clear a path, guiding Lyra through the narrow streets of Therax. They were close to the edge of the city when a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. A cart of explosives had gone off, and the streets were now filled with smoke and dust. A group of guards spotted them, their eyes flashing with rage. One of them shouted, "Stop them! They can't escape!" Ethan's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her into an alley, darting through the smoke. His mind raced as he thought of their next move. They couldn't stay on Therax for long. The peacekeepers were trained to track down fugitives, and if they stayed too long, the whole city would be after them. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, glancing at Lyra. Lyra nodded. Her eyes were still wide, but there was a glint of something else in them now. Relief? Gratitude? It was hard to tell, but something had changed between them. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Thank you. You didn't have to do this." Ethan paused for a moment, looking at her. She had been through so much, yet she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. That was rare in people who had suffered like she had. It made Ethan want to protect her even more. "I couldn't just leave you there," he said quietly. "No one deserves to live like that." They reached the edge of the city where Ethan had parked his shuttle. The old model wasn't much to look at, but it was fast and reliable. They climbed aboard, and Ethan quickly powered up the engines. As the shuttle lifted off, leaving the smog-filled city behind, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. But he also knew this was just the beginning. He had rescued one person, but there were countless others still trapped in slavery across the galaxy. The fight was far from over. Lyra sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. Ethan could see her reflection in the glass, her face still full of uncertainty. "You're safe now," he said, trying to reassure her. "You're free." Lyra didn't reply at first. Instead, she turned to face him, her eyes studying him for a long moment. Then, with a soft voice, she spoke. "I don't know what to do now," she said. "I've been a slave for so long. I don't even know where to go." Ethan nodded, understanding. It was a hard thing to go from being someone's property to being free. The world must have felt like a strange, unfamiliar place to Lyra. It was one thing to be rescued. It was another to be left alone, free, but lost. "You don't have to. Figure it out all at once," Ethan said. "I'll help you. We'll figure it out together." Lyra gave a small, hesitant smile, but it was enough for Ethan to see the faintest spark of trust in her eyes. As the shuttle soared into the stars, the future stretched out before them. Ethan didn't know what it would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave Lyra's side. She had been freed, but the journey they were about to take together would be just as difficult as the one they had left behind. But Ethan was ready. He had no idea where this journey would take them, but he wouldn't let her face it alone. The shuttle rumbled as it made its way through the starry expanse, leaving behind the dangerous streets of Therax. The harsh, red glow of the planet faded into the distance as Ethan and Lyra flew deeper into space. The only sounds in the cabin were the hum of the engines and the occasional beep from the control panel. For a while, neither of them spoke. The weight of their escape was still heavy on their shoulders. Lyra sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the stars outside, the window. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes reflecting the vast emptiness of space. Ethan glanced over at her, unsure of what to say. He wanted to comfort her, to help her process everything she had been through, but he wasn't sure how. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ethan finally asked, his voice soft but genuine. He had a feeling that this wasn't just about escaping the market. There was more to it. So much more. And he knew that she might need someone to listen. Lyra shifted in her seat but didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Ethan waited, giving her space. He wasn't going to push her, but he wanted to be there for her. "I was taken when I was a child," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family was attacked. My village, it was destroyed. I don't even remember much about them, just that they were kind and I was happy." Her eyes seemed to drift to a place far away. "The slavers found us when I was about 6 years old. I was taken and sold to the highest bidder." Ethan's heart sank. He had known that Lyra's past was dark, but hearing it from her own lips made it so much more real, so much more painful. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice low with sympathy. He had faced war, violence, and loss, but nothing like what Lyra had endured. He couldn't even begin to imagine the horrors she had experienced. Lyra gave a faint, bitter laugh. "Sorry doesn't change anything." "Nothing can." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded, respecting her feelings. They were flying far from Therax now, toward a planet called Ravan, a place where refugees and travelers could find shelter. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, and that's all he could offer her for now. Safety. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, in a way. Ethan kept his focus on flying, but his mind was on Lyra. He had never met anyone like her. She was strong, resilient, and yet there was a sadness in her eyes that made him want to protect her more than ever. After a while, Lyra spoke again, her voice steady but tinged with a sadness that wouldn't quite go away. "How did you end up in the Peacekeepers?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at her. It wasn't a question he often got asked, but it felt different with her. She wasn't just some stranger. She was someone who understood pain in a way that few people ever could. Maybe sharing a bit about himself wouldn't be so bad. "I grew up on a mining colony," Ethan began. "Not much to look at, just a bunch of rocks, dust, and people working to survive. My parents were miners, hard work, long hours, no rewards. I guess I joined the Peacekeepers because I wanted something better. Not for myself, but for the people. I left behind, I wanted to make a difference." Lyra nodded slowly. "That's brave of you." Ethan laughed softly, a small, self-deprecating smile crossing his face. "I don't know about brave. I think I was just angry. Angry at the way things were. I wanted to do something, anything, to make it stop." There was a brief pause before Lyra spoke again. "And now?" Ethan thought about it for a moment. Now I think I'm just trying to do what's right. You can't change the past, but maybe you can make the future a little better. For people like you, and for people like me." Lyra turned, her head toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time since their escape. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that felt like understanding. For the first time she seemed to see him, not just as a soldier or a rescuer, but as a person who, despite all the battles and missions, was still trying to figure things out too. "You're not so different from me," she said softly. "We both want the same thing." Ethan felt a strange warmth spread through him at her words. He had known they were both running from something, but hearing her admit that they were in this together made him feel like maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they had been before. The shuttle began its descent toward Ravon, and Lyra turned her attention back to the window, watching the planet's surface grow closer. The soft blue of the planet's oceans and the green swaths of land below were a stark contrast to the harsh, barren world they had just left behind. Ravon was a place of hope for many people, but it wasn't perfect. It had its own struggles. Still, it was a far cry from the misery they had escaped. Ethan focused on landing the shuttle, but he couldn't help but glance over at Lyra every now and then. She seemed to have settled into the quiet, her body relaxing for the first time since they'd met. She wasn't just physically tired from the escape, she was emotionally exhausted. Ethan could see that. The mental scars were the hardest to heal. As the shuttle touched down softly on Ravon's surface, Ethan powered down the engines. The air was cool, and the planet's gentle winds ruffled the shuttle's exterior. They were safe, for now. Lyra unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up slowly, stretching her limbs. Ethan stood as well, walking toward the hatch. They were about to leave the shuttle and step into the unknown, but this time, it felt different. The journey ahead wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, healing, and maybe even finding a place where they could both belong. Lyra looked at him as she stepped out of the shuttle, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice sincere. "For everything." Ethan nodded, offering her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. You're free now, that's all that matters." But as they walked toward the settlement ahead, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their bond had already become something more than just a mission. Lyra wasn't just a person he had saved. She was someone he was beginning to care about, someone who had become a part of his journey and perhaps a part of his future. The days on Ravon were peaceful, a welcome change after the chaos of Therax. Ethan and Lyra found a small, quiet place in a settlement near the planet's edge. It wasn't much, just a small building with a few basic supplies and a roof that kept out the rain. But for Lyra, it was the first time in years that she could sleep without fear of someone coming to take her away. The nightmare of slavery still haunted her, but with each passing day she started to heal, even if just a little. Ethan kept to his routine, scanning for any news from the peacekeepers, checking for any signs of trouble. But the quiet of Ravon didn't last long. One evening, just as the two of them were finishing dinner, a loud knock echoed on the door. Ethan's hand immediately went to the blaster at his side, and he motioned for Lyra to stay back. The knock came again, more forceful. This time, there was no way it was a friendly visitor. "Stay quiet," Ethan whispered, his eyes never leaving the door. He moved carefully toward the window, peering out. In the dim light, he could make out two figures standing in front of the building. One was tall, the other shorter, both armed and looking around. Ethan's heart raced. These weren't peacekeepers, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. The bounty hunters from Therax had found them. "Lyra," he said quietly, turning to face her. "We need to leave, now." Lyra's eyes widened in panic. "They found us?" she asked, her voice shaking. She had tried to forget her past, to believe she was free. But the reality of it was always just one step behind. Ethan nodded grimly. "It's time to go. Get your things. I'll cover the back." Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed a small bag, stuffing what little she had into it, while Ethan moved toward the back exit. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, and Ethan knew they didn't have much time. He took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping into the dark alley behind the building. As Lyra joined him, they both moved quickly, keeping low and staying in the shadows. The two bounty hunters had already started to move around to the back, blocking their only escape route. Ethan cursed under his breath and pulled Lyra behind a large container, trying to stay out of sight. "They'll be looking for us in the alley soon," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move fast." Just as he finished speaking, a voice called out from the front. "They're not here. Check the back." Ethan tensed. There was no time to waste. He grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her with him, running toward an old service tunnel on the far side of the settlement. The path was narrow, dark, and twisting, but it was the only way to get to the open fields beyond the settlement. "Stay close to me," he whispered. "We can't let them catch us." Lyra nodded, her face pale but determined. She had been running her whole life, and this wasn't any different. But now, she wasn't running alone. The tunnel was long and winding, and every step echoed in the dark. Ethan's mind raced as he thought about their options. Ravon was far from any major spaceports, so the bounty hunters would have to track them for a while. But Ethan wasn't planning on being caught. They reached the end of the tunnel, and the cold night air greeted them as they emerged into the open fields. The sky above was clear, with the stars shining brightly, but the peaceful view did nothing to calm the tension between them. They had to keep moving. Ethan quickly scanned the area. To the left, he could see a dense forest, and to the right, the fields stretched out for miles. There was no time to decide. "We head for the forest," he said. "It'll be harder for them to track us there." Lyra didn't argue. She followed him without question, her steps quick and light despite the fear that still gripped her. The forest wasn't far, but with every step, Ethan could hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the bounty hunters breaking through the service tunnel. There was no time to waste. They needed cover, and fast. As they entered the dense trees, the sounds of their pursuers faded. But Ethan knew it wouldn't last long. The bounty hunters were trained and experienced. They'd know how to track them through the forest. "Keep moving," Ethan urged. "We need to get to the edge of the forest before they figure out where we've gone." Lyra nodded, her breathing shallow but steady. She wasn't used to running, not like this, but there was a strength in her now that hadn't been there when they first met. Ethan was sure it came from the same place he'd gotten his strength, the will to survive. The night dragged on and the forest grew thicker. Every rustling leaf or snap of a twig made Ethan's heart skip a beat, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. Lyra's safety depended on it. Hours passed, but the pursuit didn't stop. Finally, they reached a clearing, a wide expanse of grass where the trees gave way to open sky. Ethan took a moment to catch his breath, but the moment was short-lived. The sound of engines hummed in the distance. The bounty hunters were using speeders to cover more ground. "We've got to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "We're not far from a landing zone. If we can get there, we can take my shuttle and leave this planet." Lyra nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "What if they catch us?" Ethan's expression softened, but only for a moment. "They won't," he said firmly. "We're going to make it." And with that, they ran again, moving through the clearing and back into the dense forest, hoping that the shadows would hide them long enough to make their escape. The bounty hunters were getting closer, but Ethan wasn't about to give up. Not when they were so close. As they reached the edge of the forest, the sound of the speeders grew louder. But just as they were about to be spotted, a bright light flashed from the sky. Ethan looked up, eyes wide with surprise. A ship, a familiar one, was descending rapidly toward them. The landing gear touched the ground with a soft thud, and the hatch opened. There, standing in the doorway, was Captain Lila, a former ally of Ethan's from the Peacekeepers who had tracked him down just in time. "Get in," she shouted, her voice urgent. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her toward the ship. Together, they ran toward safety, leaving the forest and the bounty hunters behind. The ship soared through the night sky, leaving the forests of Ravon behind. Ethan and Lyra sat in silence, both of them exhausted from the long hours of running. The hum of the ship's engines was a comforting sound, a sign that they were finally safe. For now. Ethan couldn't help but glance over at Lyra as they flew through space. She was staring out the window, her face illuminated by the stars. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a quiet kind of pain that Ethan couldn't ignore. He could see that Lyra had been through more than he could understand, and while he had freed her from the slave market, the scars from her past would not fade so easily. Ethan had spent years in the peacekeepers, fighting in wars, facing death, and making tough decisions. But freeing Lyra had changed something inside him. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the mission had become more than just an act of kindness. It had become something personal, something he couldn't walk away from. The ship's quiet atmosphere was interrupted by a sudden beep from the control panel. Ethan's hand immediately went to the console, his fingers flying across the buttons as he accessed the ship's systems. Something's wrong, he muttered under his breath. Lyra turned toward him, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. What is it? Ethan paused for a moment, his brow furrowing. We're being tracked. Someone's following us. Lyra's face hardened. The bounty hunters? Ethan shook his head. No, this is different. These aren't just some hired guns. Whoever is following us has more resources. We're not out of danger yet. He activated the ship's cloaking system, hoping to buy them some time. The ship's outline blurred, blending with the stars around them. But even with the cloaking system engaged, Ethan knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Whoever was tracking them was persistent. We need to get off the beaten path, Ethan said, his voice focused. I'll take us to a nearby moon. It's a remote place. We'll lose them there. Lyra nodded, but there was a nervous edge to her expression. Are you sure it's safe? Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It's the best shot we have. The ship veered off course, heading toward the dark side of a distant moon. As they approached, the moon's surface became visible, a barren, rocky landscape with no sign of civilization. Ethan knew the place. Well, it was a forgotten outpost, used only by smugglers and travelers looking to stay hidden. It would provide them with the cover they needed, but only if they acted fast. They touched down on the surface with a soft thud. The air outside was thin and cold, and the ship's sensors indicated that there were no signs of life on the moon. Ethan powered down the ship's engines and leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. We'll stay here for a while, he said, turning to Lyra. We'll rest, repair the ship, and figure out what's next. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She was still looking out the window, her face unreadable. Ethan could tell she was thinking about something important. He didn't press her for answers. Instead, he grabbed a toolkit and began working on the ship's engines, trying to keep his mind occupied. The silence between them stretched on for a while, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, in its own way. Lyra had begun to trust him, and Ethan found himself trusting her too. He didn't have all the answers, but together they had a chance to survive. After some time, Lyra stood up and walked over to the small table in the corner of the ship. She pulled out a map of the galaxy and spread it out in front of her. Ethan noticed the way she studied it, her finger tracing the lines between the stars. We need to stop running, Lyra said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. I don't want to keep hiding. I want to do something about it. Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. Do something about what? Lyra turned to face him, her eyes fierce. About the people who enslaved me. The people who are still out there, controlling others. They think they can do whatever they want and we're just supposed to hide forever. I won't let them. Ethan studied her for a long moment, seeing the determination in her eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Lyra wasn't looking for a place to hide, she was looking for a way to fight back. I get it, Ethan said, his voice steady. But we can't just charge in without a plan. We need to know who we're up against. Lyra nodded, her eyes burning with purpose. I know where we can start. There's a planet, Taros. It's under the control of the cartel that enslaved me. They have a stronghold there. If we can take down that operation, we'll send a message. To them, and to everyone else who thinks they can enslave others. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't a small task. The cartel was powerful, dangerous. Taking them down would require more than just courage. It would require a well-thought-out plan and allies. "You're sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Lyra didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'm sure." Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. This wasn't going to be easy. But he knew deep down that there was no turning back now. The moment he freed Lyra, they had both stepped into a new world, a world where they had to fight for what was right, even if the odds were against them. "We'll need help," Ethan said. "I can't do this alone." Lyra's eyes softened for a moment and she nodded. "We'll find allies, people who want to fight, people who won't let this go on." Ethan stood up and moved toward the control panel. He pulled up the map of the galaxy again and began to plot their course. There was no turning back now. They were going to take the fight to the heart of the cartel, and they weren't going to stop until it was over. He looked over at Lyra, who had joined him at the console. Her expression was fierce, but there was something else in her eyes now, something that had been missing when they first met. Hope. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to feel it too. The journey to Taros was long, and every moment that passed, Ethan felt the weight of what was to come. He and Lyra had spent the last few days planning, going over everything they knew about the cartel's operations, their stronghold, and the enemies they would face. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance to strike back. As the ship neared the atmosphere of Taros, Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. This wasn't just another mission. This wasn't about fighting to survive or following orders. This was personal. For both of them. The cartel had taken Lyra's freedom, and it had taken so much from him too. He couldn't let them keep hurting people. Lyra was standing beside him in the cockpit, her face focused, her eyes scanning the data on the console. She had become more than just a survivor. She was now an active part of this mission. She had learned how to help with the ship's systems, and her sharp instincts had made her a valuable partner. "We'll be landing near the outskirts of the stronghold," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We'll need to sneak in through the south entrance. It's less guarded and it'll give us a way to get closer without being detected." Lyra nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. She was ready, just as ready as he was. "What's the plan once we're inside?" "First, we disable their comms. That'll throw them off for a while. Then, we move to the main control room and shut down their operations. We're not here to destroy everything, we're here to make them pay and then expose what they've been doing to the galaxy." Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw something, new in her gaze, trust. She wasn't just following him because she had no other choice. She was in this with him, just as committed to the mission as he was. And that gave him strength. The ship broke through the clouds, and the stronghold came into view, a massive compound surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Ethan could already see the perimeter defenses, but he wasn't worried. They had a plan, and he trusted Lyra to stay calm under pressure. "We're almost there," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Get ready." Lyra checked her blaster and nodded. They both knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about freeing people, it was about stopping a system that had enslaved countless others. They couldn't fail. As the ship descended toward a hidden valley outside the stronghold, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. They had to move quickly. The longer they stayed, the more likely they were to be discovered. The ship touched down softly, and they both rushed out, their feet hitting the rocky ground as they made their way to the south entrance. They reached the perimeter of the compound without incident, using the cover of the tall, rocky cliffs around them. Ethan paused for a moment to check the map on his wristband. He could feel the adrenaline rising in his veins, but he kept his focus on the task ahead. "We're close," he said. "Just stay quiet and follow my lead." They moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows, their steps light on the ground. Every corner they turned brought them closer to their objective. Ethan's mind raced, running through the steps they had planned. Disable the comms, get inside, find the control room, and shut it down. Simple enough. But nothing was ever simple in this line of work. They reached the entrance, a small, unguarded door hidden beneath an overhang. Ethan paused, listening for any sounds of movement. Hearing nothing, he gestured for Lyra to follow him. With one swift motion, he opened the door, and they slipped inside, into the heart of the stronghold. The air inside was thick, filled with the hum of machinery and the low buzz of energy shields protecting the walls. Ethan signaled for Lyra to stay close as they moved through the dark corridors. They passed by rooms filled with technology, but Ethan knew they didn't have time to explore. They had a mission, and they couldn't waste precious minutes. As they approached the control room, Ethan's nerves were on edge. He could hear the faint sounds of voices up ahead, guards probably patrolling the area. Lyra stayed close to him, her eyes scanning every corner as they moved. "We need to move fast," Ethan whispered. "The comms are just ahead." They reached the control room, and Ethan carefully disabled the security system. With a soft beep, the door slid open, revealing rows of consoles and technicians working at their stations. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he stayed calm. They had trained for moments like this. In one swift motion, Ethan pulled out his blaster and fired at the ceiling, sending a burst of energy into the air. The technicians looked up in shock, and Ethan rushed inside, motioning for Lyra to follow. "Everyone stay where you are," Ethan commanded, his voice firm. "This is a peaceful takeover. Don't make me hurt anyone." The technicians froze, and Ethan could see the fear in their eyes. Lyra moved quickly to the nearest console, her fingers flying across the controls as she hacked into the system. It was clear that she knew what she was doing. She had spent years under the control of the cartel, and now she was taking her revenge. Ethan kept an eye on the door, his blaster aimed at the technicians just in case. The last thing they needed was a fight breaking out in the middle of their mission. Lyra's face lit up with success as she disabled the main communication system. "They won't be able to call for help for a while," she said. "We have a window of opportunity." Ethan nodded. "Good work. Now, let's take down, the cartel." But just as they were about to move forward, the door at the far end of the room opened, and a tall figure stepped inside. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man who had come to stop them, the leader of the cartel. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice cold and threatening. "This is our territory and you're trespassing." Ethan's grip tightened on his blaster, but he knew they had to be smart about this. The leader was powerful and he wasn't alone. There was no way they could take him down in a straight fight. They needed to outsmart him. "I didn't come to start a war," Ethan said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I came to make sure people like her," he gestured to Lyra, "never have to suffer again." The cartel leader smiled, darkly. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing." Ethan didn't respond. He just aimed his blaster at the leader, ready to act if things escalated. Lyra stood by his side, ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was their final stand, and they were going to make sure it counted. The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The cartel leader, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile, stood before Ethan and Lyra, his confidence unwavering. But Ethan wasn't intimidated. He had come too far, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to turn back now. "Move aside," the cartel leader said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've already lost. You don't stand a chance." Ethan's hand tightened around his blaster, but his expression remained calm. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe we don't stand a chance, but we're not alone and we're not backing down." Lyra stood beside him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. "You've heard enough, people," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. "It ends today." The cartel leader laughed, the sound echoing in the cold room. "You think you can stop me? You've already disabled my communications. You think that will make a difference?" Ethan's mind raced, but he knew this wasn't about technology or firepower. This was about heart, about the will to fight for what was right. Lyra had been through too much, and the people they had freed weren't going to be forgotten. This was bigger than just them. "You're wrong," Ethan said, stepping forward. "It's not about what we can do alone. It's about what we can do together." The cartel leader's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You still don't get it, do you? You're standing in the middle of my empire. You've already lost." Ethan didn't flinch. "It's your empire that's crumbling. You just don't know it yet." In that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. The heavy sound of boots on metal floors grew louder, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. More cartel soldiers. They were closing in. "Get ready," Ethan said, his voice low. "We're not alone, remember?" Lyra nodded, her hand going to the blaster at her side. They couldn't afford to let the cartel leader escape or call for backup. This was their one chance, and they had to make it count. Just as the door to the control room slammed open, Ethan and Lyra sprang into action. Ethan fired a shot at one of the soldiers entering, hitting him square in the chest. The other soldiers hesitated, momentarily stunned by the sudden attack. Lyra darted forward, her movements quick and precise as she disarmed another soldier. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a fighter, and she was fighting for her future, for the freedom of others like her. The cartel leader shouted orders to his men, but it was too late. The control room was a blur of movement as Ethan and Lyra took down one soldier after another, using the environment to their advantage. The leader was backing away toward the far corner of the room, his hands raised in surrender. "You've made a mistake," the cartel leader said, his voice trembling with anger. "You'll never get away with this." Ethan advanced toward him, his blaster still raised. "I don't care about getting away with it," he said coldly. "I care about making sure people like you never get to hurt anyone again." Before the cartel leader could respond, Lyra stepped forward, her gaze sharp and focused. "You don't get to decide who lives and who dies," she said, her voice filled with the weight of everything she had been through. "Not anymore." With that, the cartel leader was taken down. The rest of the soldiers, realizing they were outmatched, surrendered without a fight. It was over. The silence that followed felt heavy, but there was a strange sense of peace in the air. Ethan and Lyra stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the fallen soldiers. The mission had been a success. The cartel's stronghold had been destroyed, and their operation had come to an end. But for Ethan and Lyra, this was just the beginning. "We did it," Lyra said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Yeah, we did. But it's not over. There are still more people to free." Lyra glanced at him, her eyes filled with both determination and exhaustion. "I know, but this is a start. This is the first step." They walked out of the control room, leaving the destruction behind. The compound was quiet now, the echoes of their fight fading into the distance. It felt like a weight had been lifted from Lyra's shoulders, and Ethan felt the same sense of relief. They had fought for something bigger than themselves, and it had made all the difference. As they stepped outside into the sunlight, Ethan looked at Lyra. The stronghold was in ruins, and the once imposing structure now felt small, insignificant. The sky was clear, and the wind carried the scent of freedom. "So what now?" Lyra asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. Ethan smiled, the weight of the past few days lifting from his chest. "Now we rebuild. We find more people who need help. We keep fighting." Lyra nodded, her eyes shining with a new kind of hope. Together, Ethan held her gaze for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. They had come a long way, through battles, loss, and pain, but they had found each other in the midst of it all, and that made everything feel possible. As they walked toward the horizon, the world seemed a little brighter. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while it didn't feel impossible. And as they moved forward, side by side, they knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead with strength, courage, and the unwavering belief that they could make the galaxy a better place.